I'm PepperySplash, and these are my top 5 favorite Guilty Gear players.
With the kill on the wall break, it should be enough. PepperySplash closes out Season 3 finale as your champion.
So my first pick for my favorite Guilty Gear player would be FAB, the Potemkin God. When I was originally getting into Guilty Gear with Xrd, he was one of the players that had, you know, a bunch of highlights and compilations made of him on Japanese sites. And I got really inspired kind of watching him, just seeing how optimal he was in like every situation. And that was so impressive to me. And that's kind of carried out through whether I watched him in Xrd or Plus R or Strive. He's just always labbing and always just doing like optimal combos and situations. And that's something I personally really like when I watch different kinds of players, is seeing, you know, how much they can know about the game and be able to optimize different situations that come up. He's stuck with Pot through, you know, thick and thin, whether he's been good or very bad. Seeing him play some matchups made me try and, like, when I was having difficult times in matchups, I'm like, okay, maybe I can like dig a little deeper, try and find some different approaches, and seeing him try to do all those things and just persevering for like 20 plus years at this point was always something I found really cool. Notable habits, I think it'd be the habit again of just like trying to figure out situations where you can use different kinds of system mechanics. So for example, in Plus R, he was one of the only players that really used the mechanic slashback, which is it's essentially a parry. And so when I was picking up Plus R, I was like, I'm gonna try and figure out where I can use this slashback mechanic. And it worked out pretty well. Seeing him optimize those system mechanics was something that I thought was really cool. And so I always try and think about where I can implement them, even if they're very difficult. So for example, like in Strive, the IB timing is 2 frames, which is very, very tight. I thought I was good enough to be able to consistently do it, and so I just kept at it, and now I'm pretty known in Strive for having like very consistent IB timings. And so yeah, so you probably have FAB to thank for that. So my second favorite player would be another Japanese player, Nage. Honestly, fairly similar reasons to FAB, because Fouts as a character has always been someone who's kind of reliant on like the RNG aspect of throwing items. So you throw an item, you get something random. And seeing him essentially create like a flowchart for every possible item and how to best use them was always super cool to me, even though Fouts as a character never really, you know, spoke to me, and it was never a character I was interested in. Seeing him do all these different like combos and sequences with random items really, really fast was just always super, super interesting to me. Yeah, he's definitely a showman, and that's also you know, kind of cool to see. And also he's also written quite a lot about different kinds of like competitive mindset things. Like back in Xrd, I remember him writing about how he approaches tournaments and, you know, feelings of like nervousness, and some of them included things like try not to be as nervous because the other person is also going to be nervous. So you always have that going for you, and never kind of let what might happen on stage get to you too much, and just kind of do your best and keep playing. So my third one, I'm going to go to someone who started in Strive, and really this was their first fighting game, and that's Umisho. So really just kind of like extremely consistent player across Strive's lifespan, going from HC to Soul. And one thing that always impressed me about her, especially when it comes to her defense, is it's very reminiscent of older players, just in terms of her being quite disciplined in, you know, when to press certain things. Because kind of as I've played fighting games for the past 10 plus years, one thing I've noticed, especially with newer players, is they tend to be a bit on the crazier side when it comes to defense, and just doing super high risk, high reward type options. And so seeing someone whose very first fighting game was something that kind of tends to reward that kind of play style, seeing her still be able to maintain like a lot of discipline in terms of those kinds of decisions, has always been interesting to me. Yeah, and again, and also with her, you'll kind of see this as a theme across the different players that I enjoy watching, is that it's all about just like optimizing these different situations. So like Umisho, especially for Soul, she really was kind of pushing different strategies with the character. So whereas before a lot of it was, you know, kind of strike throw based, and while she still does quite a lot of that because it's Soul, she also does a lot of different kinds of like mix-ups and stuff that a lot of the, you know, Japanese Soul players don't do, for instance. And I think that ability to kind of create your own play style, I think is very impressive. You kind of bring your own unique perspective to the very first game you play, in terms of like how you learn what things are good, what things are bad. Some older players, when they try to go into Strive, it was very difficult for them to kind of let go of previous mechanics or like how things should be played. So not having that kind of roadblock in your mind can be very helpful in terms of being able to think about like, okay, how can I perform better in specifically this game. If I remember correctly, her initial reasoning for switching from HC to Soul was because, you know, she just found him more fun. And that was what I went through in Xrd, because Johnny, who's considered like the best character in Xrd, or at the very least top 2. Everyone, when they ask me like, why would you drop this character? He's so good. I'm like, well, I just find Venom more interesting. At the time that Umisho switched, that was still at the point where Mochi hadn't won last year's Arc Revo yet, and so the opinion of Soul in North America was still relatively low and pretty like underexplored, but she had confidence in the character and her ability to bring out the best in that character, and I think it ended up showing with just her consistent results across Strive as it's gone on. As 4th player, so I'm gonna go with another Strive player. It's, you know, my Zato bro, Jonathan Tene. I think he's kind of the prime example of what you can achieve through kind of like hard work of studying things. He's like the most knowledgeable person about the game. Like if you ask him a question about, you know, frame data or a lot of specific interactions, he knows those things like off the top of his head. He's memorized a ton of different frame data. I think it's a skill not a lot of players develop because it's very hard to have that kind of work ethic in fighting games, which is why you see a lot of people, I mean, in general, a lot of people just avoid training mode and that kind of thing, but like he lives in training mode. And so seeing him, you know, translate that mindset into applying it into tournament and, you know, being so successful with it has always been something that I found very impressive about him. Because we have our different strengths as players, some matchups are harder for us than the other person, and so I've talked with him with matchups that I've had that I just, you know, don't see the vision on how you're supposed to consistently win it, and so whenever I've bounced ideas off of him in terms of like adapting certain neutral strategies or like how to maybe structure offense a bit versus certain characters, that's what's been very useful to me back when I played Zato. So my 5th player is going to be Mochi. I first met him in Evo of, I believe it was 2018, was the very first Evo I went to, and I played him in casuals, and he is like by far the most fun I've ever had playing someone in Xrd. What makes him so fun to play is that his playstyle is so unique, and it's really something that can't really be emulated by other players. So back in Xrd, when people learning Soul would ask like what players to watch, Mochi's name would come up, but only in the sense of, yeah, Mochi's like one of the best Souls, but you shouldn't really try to play like him because, you know, his reactions are ridiculous, his execution's really good, and just his game awareness is extremely good. When you watch him play Strive, it's kind of the same thing. His playstyle with Soul is very unique just in terms of how he uses his air options, how he chooses to just approach neutral in general, and he's probably my favorite Strive player to watch currently. Yes, so actually he was originally a Bridget player in Plus R. He went under a different tag, I believe it was Mugen. He wasn't particularly well known in Plus R, but in Xrd there was just a point where he started playing Xrd again, and he picked up Soul, and he like very quickly became one of the best Japanese players. He did really well in like all the exhibitions. He never had too much of an opportunity to travel abroad for tournaments, but anyone who is familiar and following the Japanese scene with Jonio-san's streams, like we all knew Mochi was like an incredible player. It's kind of weird now because in my mind it's almost kind of reversed now in Strive than it was in previous games, because in previous games what I always thought was the primary difference was just the general knowledge of interactions. So for example, I play Venom in Xrd, and so I was able to get away with, you know, quite a few offensive things that certain players weren't as familiar with in North America. But when I went to Japan and I was playing like all day in the arcades, just their general awareness of those situations and not letting me get away with those types of things was much higher. They tend to go into training mode more. Like I think FAB and Nage at some point posted like their hours in training mode, and it was like 60 days worth of training mode or something like that. So it's just kind of the general familiarity with those situations that I think really separated the Japanese players from the rest of the world, really. Especially when it comes to offense, Japanese players tend to be a little more freeform, whereas in North America, or not just North America, but North America and EU, we tend to be focused on kind of optimizing more set play type focused things. And so I think that's kind of comes with its own strengths because you're able to more consistently take advantage of the situations you get. But then with the Japanese players, because they're focused on quite a lot of like neutral interactions and stuff like that, they tend to have very unique approaches to that aspect of it.